giving me this opportunity to talk to everybody today, and also to wish everybody a happy coming out day. What we are going to do today is sort of demonstrate how the things that I am interested in doing can be useful. So I am a psychologist, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means in the context of this presentation as we go. I'm interested in the social psychology of learning styles and its implications for pedagogy, but I want to begin with a disclaimer. So the first thing that I want to set in place is that what I am talking about today has to do with students who do not have learning or developmental disabilities. This is for students who are not disabled. So it can definitely still apply to students in those situations or in those kinds of learning contexts. But for this, what I'm primarily going to be talking about is the other student population that we think about. Now, the reason why I start with this disclaimer is because I am an experimental social psychologist. So this is what I am, and it is different from a clinical psychologist or even an educational psychologist. And what I want to do is demonstrate how we look at what you could almost think of as normal people in normal situations, and therefore social psychology is absolutely applicable to the classroom. Unfortunately, it doesn't get applied to the classroom very much, and it's strange because I think that there's a lot of potential virtue there for mending or melding these two fields together, social psychology and the scholarship of teaching and learning. So here's where we go. The first thing is my punchline. I'm going to start with the bottom line. The bottom line is much of what we recommend that teachers do is right. So I want to make this talk be about why, so that we can understand why. So thank you very much. I appreciate having, no, I'm just kidding. I want to start here so that you have a framework of where we're going to be going. The first thing that we want to do, or that I want to do here, is explain what I am working on in particular. So learning styles are something that have kind of come into common knowledge. A lot of people will have heard of them before, and a lot of people will have some sort of idea about how they work or what they are supposed to be applicable for or to. And so what I'm going to be approaching today is learning styles theory, which basically says that students will learn better if teachers match the modality of their presentation of information to the student's learning style. So if the presentation of the information matches how students learn in a particular presentation, then they will learn better than if it does not. Now here is a sort of a commentary on where this has gone. If you can't read the caption, it says, this student is addressing the teacher, and she says, "As we start a new school year, Mr. Smith, I just want you to know that I am an abstract sequential learner, and I trust that you'll conduct yourself accordingly." So the idea that we have some sort of benefit from matching what students are able to do in terms of the kinds of information they take in or learn best from in our classroom seems like it would be really spot on. And one of the most common ways that we classify different kinds of learners is along 3 different categories. So you'll have heard people talk about being a visual learner, where somebody supposedly picks up information best if they see it. Other people are auditory learners, where they will learn best if they hear something, either some sort of spoken information or even music and things that are other kinds of auditory experiences. And some students will classify themselves as kinesthetic learners, so learners who learn best by feeling or doing something interactive with the material. Now, there are actually quite a lot of different kinds of learning styles that psychologists have examined experimentally to try and see where we are finding evidence to support them. As a shout out to the Liberal Arts and Sciences Reading Group, for example, Daniel Willingham offers a dozen different kinds of learning style categorizations or delineations that psychologists have tested. So if you're in one of these reading groups, you'll come across this information a little bit later. But he's a cognitive psychologist, and he's talking about research on these different kinds of styles and how they are going to be able to be demonstrative of differences in research, finding empirical support. So he offers a dozen different examples of cognitive styles and how psychology has failed to find empirical support for the theory that matching presentation to a learner's style makes for better learning. So why does this theory persist in popularity? Why do we still think of it as common knowledge? Why are we still applying it to our classrooms as if it was supported by empirical research? And the reason that is still something that we find sort of a powerful theory is because there are some parts of the theory that do have grains of truth, or they are supportable. So the first thing we can do is establish what is undisputed. There are things that we know about students that nobody is arguing, and they can seem like they support the idea of learning styles theory. The first thing is that students have different abilities, they have different interests, they have different background knowledge, and they have different preferences. That is undisputed. We can see that in our classrooms. We can see it in our students or our classmates, in our children, or anyone that you are looking at. We can say, well, of course, students have different kinds of abilities, interests, background knowledge, and preferences. That doesn't yet make for support for the theory. The other undisputed thing is that students have varying success at tasks in different modalities. Some students do seem to perform better when they are doing a task that is based on visual information or based on some sort of physical interaction. And so we can see differences in their success in different modalities. But again, this does not necessarily mean that there is support for learning styles theory as it is stated. Now, the other thing that goes into the idea that learning styles theory or learning styles as a reality is common knowledge is an aspect of the fact that it feels true. It seems intuitive. So if you are familiar with Stephen Colbert, he is a comedian who has a satire news show on Comedy Central. He coined an extraordinarily useful term. That term is truthiness. Truthiness is defined as the truth, the sense of a thing that is true because it feels true, almost in spite of actual evidence. So if something feels like it is true, that is another way of kind of saying it's common sense. A lot of times common sense is actually not supported by evidence, and yet it is traditionally held so that the more people who believe it and the more people who believe it for a long time somehow gives it the power of truth. So as a psychologist, as an experimental social psychologist, what I am interested in is actually finding empirical support, some sort of research evidence that says that, yes, learning styles as a theory of how students learn or how students learn better is supported. We have to look for particular kinds of evidence, and that's what we're not finding yet. So despite Stephen Colbert's really pithy explanation of the feeling of truth, there are two other things that make learning styles theory feel true. One of them is something called the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is a bias that every person has, and it is a bias that is not indicative of that person not being honest or not being straightforward. It is just a way that we think about things naturally. So the confirmation bias says that when we are out in the world and we have pre-existing attitudes or opinions about something, we are going to notice and remember evidence that supports what we believe. We are not necessarily going to notice and remember evidence that is disconfirming to our belief. So when we feel like we say, oh, well, we've got X, Y, and Z examples of how this theory is true, whether that's learning styles theory or any other kind of thing that's common knowledge, a lot of times those may absolutely be real examples of support for that theory. But what we have to pay attention to as scientists is also the disconfirming evidence. We have to pay attention to the hits as well as the misses, because there might be several hits. There might be several things that truly do support or look like they support a theory. But if we are disregarding the things that are not in support of that, then we are not having a true picture. We're not looking at the actual evidence holistically. So there's one thing. Every person does it, and in the context of learning styles theory or evaluating the veracity of learning styles theory, we can think about how there does seem to be evidence of the veracity of that theory. The other thing, we also know that we have a saying in psychology. It's something that we drill into our intro psych students. In fact, I make them shout it at the top of their lungs. I open up the classroom doors and see if I can bother people down the hall. Because it is so important for them to remember as they go through their college career, even if they are not a psychology major. The idea here is that correlation is not the same as causation. So a correlation is a relationship. It's a statement of a relationship between two different variables, where if you know the value of one variable, you can predict the value of the other variable because of its relationship. You know the nature of its relationship. When we do research and find correlations, we only have that one snapshot of a relationship. What we don't have when we have information about a correlation is any information about a causal relationship between those two variables. If we've got variable x and we've got variable y and we know that they're related to each other, we don't know if something about x causes y to happen in this way, or if something about y causes x to happen in this way, or if there's something entirely else that is affecting both, and that's what's creating that picture of a relationship. So when we say that there's a relationship between two things, we cannot say that one has caused the other with any kind of confidence. The way that this is relevant to this particular discussion is that we see that there is a relationship sometimes with a teacher, for instance, changing how they're teaching to make it so that they are accommodating their students' learning styles and presenting information for their course in a way that supposedly matches their students' learning styles in an attempt to improve their learning. Now let's say a student does that, okay? Let's say they do that and then they find that their students' scores improve. We can't necessarily yet say that that is support for learning styles theory. So I would ask you, actually, if a teacher changes their teaching style to accommodate learners' learning style or their students' learning style, and they see those scores improve, why else might those scores have improved besides that new accommodation? What do you think? Maybe they're studying more, the students are studying more. What else? Yeah? Okay, so maybe more time has elapsed and the students are having more time to actually work with the material. Why else? Confirmation bias, yes. If the teachers are the ones who are evaluating their information, absolutely, yes. So the students themselves might have a change of heart that is affecting their performance. Why else? I saw your hand up a moment ago. Okay. The teacher might be changing their teaching not only to match their style, but also maybe in the time that they're putting towards preparing their lessons, or the way that they are, I guess, emotionally invested in the presentation of their material. If they're trying to do something so that they can be a better teacher, maybe that is translating into enthusiasm or any kind of other emotional difference in the classroom. Are there any other reasons? The material maybe got easier. Yeah, something about the material itself. Is that it?
Perhaps a change in method of communication.
Yeah, perhaps a change in the method of communication, a change in the modality is actually suited better to the content of the information than it was before. So these are all different reasons why we might see something as simple as a correlation between a teacher accommodating their students' learning styles and their scores improving, but yet you guys just came up with a dozen different reasons, aside from the explanation offered by learning styles theory, that would be worth testing. So I'm not saying that all of those reasons are true. I'm saying that those are also testable ideas. And if we want to make sure that we are trying to look for empirical evidence, we still want to test those ideas as well. Not just saying, well, yeah, learning styles is not a thing, so we want to think of something else, and that's going to be the answer. Still talking about finding empirical evidence. Good. The next thing that we can think about there is, all right, if we've got this, this compendium of reasons why we see a lot of support for learning styles and why it persists in belief or in common knowledge, both among educators and students, we want to see now what we do know. What do we know that's true in the sense of we have empirical evidence for it, and how can we put that in the service of improving our teaching? The first thing we know is that there is a difference between talking about cognitive ability and style. So first of all, cognitive ability is a person's capacity for success in different kinds of thoughts or thinking. You can think of this as talent. So it's not the exact same thing, but that's kind of along those same lines. A person can be good or bad at something. They can have high ability or low ability, but that ability is some sort of indication of their capacity for success. In contrast, cognitive style is a tendency to think a particular way. So it's not the same as ability. This here is going to be more relevant to habits or biases. When I say bias, I don't mean, again, some sort of dishonesty or not paying attention to information, but if you have a particular way that you tend to think about things, then that'll take you in a particular direction a lot of the time. So that's kind of like a bias. It's directing your thoughts in a particular direction, and that, or a habit of thinking about things the same way, is what we mean by style. So ability and style are completely different from each other, because ability can be high or low, it can be good or bad, but style should be equivalently useful in any situation. The style a person is using should not directly impact their ability, or it's not the same thing, it's not synonymous with ability. To illustrate this difference, I can give you a personal example. As a bowler, I have a particularly awful form. So the way that my style of bowling is, I start at the back of the thing, I'm holding my ball. I try and find the light one so I can chuck it. And then I walk up to the line, kind of zero in on the thing, step back, and underhand sort of chuck it. Sometimes it bounces a little, and then there's a terrible backspin, and it goes back down all the way to the lane, and often I get strikes. I'm awesome. But the idea is that is my style. Other people, more serious bowlers, have that very serious kind of scowling face and this posture. They walk up and they've got this smooth thing, and then they step. I don't even know how to do it, actually. They step back and they're sticking their leg out and sliding it down the thing. It's very smooth. It's very attractive. But the idea that that is a better style is only going to be indicated by scores, right? So if I get the same bowling score with my sort of horrific style that occasionally hurts my hip, and somebody else gets a different score with their very smooth and polished style, then those two things are indicative of equivalent ability in the scores, but the styles are just personal preferences. They don't have the same kind of meaning across these two words. When we get back to learning styles theory, though, a lot of times you hear these phrases or these words used interchangeably. when we talk about cognitive ability and we conflate it with cognitive style, we're already going to be muddying the water and causing problems in how we understand what these things are doing in terms of the actual functioning of our brain. Speaking of functioning of our brain, if we're going to take a step aside a moment and think about what cognitive psychology says, so I'll get back to social in just a second. If we think about what cognitive psychology says about how our memory works, we've got a couple of different metaphorical separations that we can propose in order to demonstrate how knowledge is stored long term. So the premise here is that learning, if we're interested in learning, learning is a lasting change in thinking or ability or behavior that is based on experience. So that experience could be doing something, it could be reading something, it could be hearing somebody speak, but the learning part is that lasting change in thought or behavior. Now the thoughts that go into what we think of when we think about a student learning the content of our course is the knowledge that we are storing away in our long-term memory. In our long-term memory, we can split it into two different major branches. The first branch is our procedural memory, so our memory of knowing how to do things. If you try and verbally explain how to ride a bicycle, you could probably come up with some sort of approximation, but really it is a process of knowing how to move your body, how to balance, how to work with the different physical forces that work on you when you're on a bicycle. Those are procedural memories, knowing how to do something. On the other side, we've got declarative memories, and that is the content of what we know, so knowing what or knowing that X, Y, and Z. So we might be able to declare the things that we know. We can say the things that we know that are stored in our declarative memories. This is all part of long-term memory. Now we can split declarative memory itself into two branches. So there we might separate the difference between semantic memories and episodic memories. With semantic memories, what we are talking about is general knowledge. So if you understand how ice is made, or who's running for president and how our government has 3 branches, or if you understand how to speak a particular language, the content of your language is stored in your semantic memories. So that is information, that's the meaning of things. On the other side, we have our episodic memories, and those are sort of autobiographical. Those are still things that we can declare, we can talk about, but there we're talking more about our personal experiences. We're talking about things that have happened to us. So to contrast these two branches, you could say, I understand the general tradition of birthday parties in America. I know what to expect if I were to get invited to one and show up. That could be something that's in your semantic memory. But if you were remembering your last birthday party and how it went, then that would be something that is an episode or an episodic memory that you're storing about your own self. So if you think about a mnemonic to help you remember this, think about your life as a really tragically dull television series. Now, if your television series has episodes, then you can think about the episode where you had that birthday party, or you can think about the episode where you learned to ride a bike. And those kinds of things are going to be part of your episodic memory because they are autobiographical. So we split our information into these kinds of categories, and this is kind of an artificial separation, but it helps us think about how information is getting stored away. If we actually think about the how of it, again, we can kind of do a metaphorical depiction and look at how information comes in to our memory so that we can finally get it to our long-term memory. On the far side, we start with our sensory memory. So the stuff that's coming in there is all of the information that is coming into your mind via your 5 senses. So you are hearing my voice through your ears right now. You are seeing me stand up on this stage with your eyes. You are probably feeling your clothing against your skin. If you think about it now, you weren't a minute ago. And you are maybe hearing other things besides what I'm saying up here. Like you might hear the fan in the projector, or you might hear somebody scratching a pen across paper. All of that information is coming in to your sensory memory, but not all of it is important. It's all coming in, it's all unstoppably coming in, but we only need to pay attention to or care about what is actually relevant to our situation. So you don't need to pay attention to the sound of the fan, and you probably don't need to pay attention to the feeling of your clothing against your skin. So that information comes in and it's almost immediately dumped. What happens to get it to our short-term memory, which is now often called our working memory, we have to pay attention to what is important. So the process of getting it from sensory memory to our short-term memory is paying attention to it. If we're paying attention to it, it comes into our working memory, which is where we are actually thinking about the information or the input. So your working memory, your short-term memory, is what you think about when you think about thinking. So that's kind of like the desktop of your mind. That's what you're working on right here. Now, all of the stuff that goes into your mind and is in this phase is not still all important. If you've gotten something in, your attention was brought to it, it got into your desktop, you might still decide it's not necessary to keep, and that also will dump out. It'll just be lost. The way that we get information from our working memory, our short-term memory, into our long-term memory is actually a process of interaction with the information that is here that we're working on new and the information that we already have. So you'll see that these arrows are bidirectional. When you have information coming into your working memory, you are understanding it, you're processing it based on what you already know. So you have an understanding of this information because you have some sort of pre-existing experience, or you've learned something about this information that lets you get a context for it. Put in the language of our classes, this would be our prerequisite, and this would be the course you're in now. So if you're getting new information, you're more likely to understand it if you have that prerequisite. If you are in that advanced class and you didn't take the prereq, you're going to be lost. You're not going to have a framework or a way to interpret that new information very easily. So all of that information is sort of churning around in here, getting mixed with old information, and we're rehearsing it. And one of the ways that we can really establish it firmly in our long-term memory is to get it into some sort of personal representation. So if we can get it in our semantic memory by understanding what it means, or we can get it into our episodic memory by tying it to something in our life, then that's going to be more firmly embedded or encoded into our memory than if it is just trying to memorize something via rehearsal, just repetition. So if you're memorizing something, you can memorize something without understanding it. That's what flashcards are excellent for. So the idea there is we want to have our students mix together what they already know, form new connections, but really process deeply all of this new information. What we call that is the process of elaboration. So if we're taking information from our long-term memory and we are throwing it into the mix, we're putting it back on our desktop so that our new information is becoming integrated with it, that's what makes good memories, and that's what makes us have a firmer memory of that new information. But go back to here a minute. If we have information coming in through our sensory memory, that might be the sound of a thing, the sound of my voice, as opposed to the content of the thing, which would be different because that is going to be determined here. But the sound of my voice, or the sound of any teacher's voice as they're lecturing to students, is generally not what is the teacher's intent for students to learn. It's not important for students to remember that I was talking and my voice sounded like this, and I had a particular level of volume, and I was especially mellifluous. But we want them to think about what we are saying, the content, the meaning, the semantics of what we're saying. So if we think about an auditory learner, and we say that somehow the information that they're bringing in as auditory input is going to make more sense or help them learn better, we're sort of conflating the fact that auditory information is one thing, but you still have to process it. You still have to think about it to get at the semantic information. So we want to match what we're talking about there. Now, the idea here that we want to take forward is, if this is how we have some cognitive background, let's get right to the social. And you'll think that it took me a long time to get here, but I had to lay the framework. The first thing that we can do is we can look through this kind of information through social psychology's lens and say that, all right, we've established why cognitively learning styles theory doesn't hold a lot of water, but let's think about how it does still work in terms of social psychology. So thinking about people as people instead of people as brains. We've got, first of all, the idea of identity. If you have a person's self-concept written out on a piece of paper, somebody might define themselves as, I am a social psychologist, I am an American woman, I am a vegetarian, or you might hear a student say, I am a visual learner. When that statement comes out like that, what happens is that becomes less of some sort of information about how their brain is working and more about how they have defined themselves, their self-concept. So as a social psychologist or as a teacher, if I say, you know, there's no such thing as learning styles support for that theory, so sorry about your identity there, that's not really going to work very well in our classrooms, right? That's not a helpful thing. That's not constructive. So we don't want to take that approach. We want to think about how students, especially coming out of elementary school and high school, have heard about this so much they have come to think of it as part of themselves. They are a visual learner. The other thing that's true about things in people's identity is that personally relevant information is interesting. We like to think about ourselves. We like to talk about ourselves. We like to learn about ourselves. And so if I think of myself as a visual learner and I'm taking in information in a visual format, then that is suddenly personally relevant, as opposed to if I'm hearing a lecture or if I'm reading a text. Actually, that would be visual. If I'm seeing some sort of interactive behavior, that's maybe not tied into my identity. So maybe that's less interesting. Maybe that's more difficult to remember because it's harder to match to some sort of episodic memory. Another thing that social psychology will tell us is that people, whether they are students or regular people, have a belief in a theory of intelligence, and their belief is going to affect their motivation. So one of the distinctions that people can choose here is to believe that intelligence is a fixed quantity. You are born with a particular level of intelligence, and that's how smart you are. That's how smart you're always going to be. Or you can think of intelligence as a fluid thing, that you are born however you're born, but if you work hard, you can get smarter. Or if you don't, you will somehow have less intelligence. Intelligence is more about the process or the progression than some sort of fixed quantity. What we know here is that different levels of motivation accompany different beliefs. If a student believes that their intelligence is fixed, when they come across a challenge, especially if they fail that challenge, then what that is going to do is encourage them to avoid challenges like that in the future, because we go back to identity. If you come across a task that you suck at, then that is somehow going to be a statement about you as a person, as opposed to a challenge that you can address as an opportunity. So if your ability is high and you believe in fixed intelligence, then you're going to be happy as long as you're doing well. And so you might seek out challenges because you have a sense of yourself as highly intelligent. That level is fixed. But if your ability is low, you're going to avoid challenges because you don't want the risk of failure. On the other hand, if we have fluid intelligence, belief in intelligence as a fluid construct, then a person with that opinion, whether their ability is high or low, is going to see challenges as something of an opportunity. If I work hard or if I approach this task as a learning experience, then I can demonstrate increasing competence, I I can master a skill, and whether I started out with high or low ability is not necessarily relevant, because it's not where I started, it's where I end up. So if we have students believing that they are a particular kind of learner and they learn best in that format and they cannot learn as well in a different format, it sort of parallels this kind of belief in intelligence as being fixed or fluid. So that belief is going to affect their motivation. If a student is a visual learner and all their teacher does is lecture, then that student's motivation is going to drop. Their interest is going to drop because it's not personally relevant, and their feeling of potential or opportunity for success will be limited as well because it's not how they learn. So we want to think about the interaction of these beliefs and a student's identity as well. The last social psychological interpretation of learning styles is the idea of locus of control. So every person has some sort of sense of what is responsible for their behavior. You can either believe that the source or the reason for your behavior is outside of yourself, or that it is inside of yourself. If you have an external locus of control, that means that outside forces are sort of directing you. It is more of a deterministic kind of attitude. Whereas an intrinsic or an internal locus of control says that anything that you do is because you did it. Tied to this idea is the idea of an attribution. An attribution is just an explanation for behavior. But if you think about what this means in the context of learning styles theory, let's say this visual learner student gets a bad grade on an exam. They get a bad grade because they're a visual learner and the teacher was only lecturing and having them do, I don't know, oral presentations or something. That reason for their behavior on the test is external to them. So we don't think about how that makes it necessarily true or realistic. We think about how that person is explaining it to themselves. Now, that being said, if we think about the cognitive psychology, the social psychology, and the bottom line that I started with, where we finish up is what we should do as instructors, as teachers, as people who are training future teachers. And like I said at the very beginning, what we're doing already is largely right. But let's understand why now. So the first thing that we should do is say, all right, here's our prescription. Let's say our encouragement is that teachers should do this. First, we want to suit the presentation of the information to its content. That might sound like a silly thing to say, but if I take it to its sort of extreme silliness, let's say that I am a teacher and I am only teaching through interpretive dance. Everything that I do, I teach through interpretive dance. Now, that would be tailored to kinesthetic learners if they're dancing as well, or if I'm teaching them how to dance. But if we are learning math, that is going to be a really difficult way to learn because math and dance are not particularly well suited to each other as far as how we present that information. If I was teaching dance, then interpretive dance would be an excellent way to teach that because that is a match. So we want to think about matching the presentation to the content or to the task rather than to the learner, because the learner is going to take that information in semantically. It's not necessarily the sensory experience that matters, it is their understanding of the meaning. Number two, the idea that we present the same information multiple times in different modalities lets us get at that idea of rehearsal. So not just memorizing something, but maybe working on something again and again, keeping it churning around in your working memory on your desktop there. That's going to help students learn because it gives them more ways to understand the material from different angles. Now, I have an asterisk by that because a lot of times we're already told to do that as educators. We're already told, present things in multiple modalities. In the language of learning styles theory, we might be saying, accommodate your students. But here I'm saying, just do this because it helps memory encoding. The third thing, we want to vary our tasks during class to reclaim students' attention. If you remember the step between sensory memory and working memory, the input coming in through your senses is filtered through that attention label, and what is paid attention to is brought into the thinking part of thinking. So if you are droning on as a lecturer, or if you are always doing the same thing in a task, students' attention is going to wane, because that's what any person's attention is going to do. So if you switch things up, just the change of it will be enough to get them thinking about it again for a moment. The last thing, we should encourage our students to transform the information into their preferred modality themselves. So let's make them make that information personalized. Say, all right, if you are a visual learner, take this information and draw a cognitive map or draw a conceptual map for it. While you're studying it, if you're personalizing it, what you're doing is you're elaborating on that information. You're taking what you already know and you are tying it to the new information, which makes it be what we know is more solidly integrated into our memory. So that's what teachers should do now that we understand both the cognitive background but also the social background of learning styles as it actually is supported by evidence. So here's our bottom line again. This is where we started, although I did add a couple of words. So the bottom line is much of what we already recommend teachers do is a good idea. But if you can understand why, then both teachers and students can benefit because they can expand on that information, they can innovate, and they can come up with some sort of adaptation to their field or to their strengths as a topic or as a content area. So that's where we end up. That is the implication. I took a little bit longer than I meant to, but let me just say, ta-da! All right.